Throughout the world, amidst all the bad news of failed projects and efforts to help people in hunger, there are some wonderful successes. Perhaps no success in this century has been more striking or more successful than the organoponics movement in modern-day Cuba. Organoponics, or organic hydroponics, uses natural organic fertilizers instead of chemical fertilizers. They use organic compost instead of sand or volcanic rock, and natural pest control. Organoponics started in Cuba in 1991 after the Soviet Union collapsed. Cuba had experienced favored nation status with the Soviet Union, trading their sugar for oil. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba's available oil was cut in half. Within a year, the food supply dwindled. Tractors stood idle in the fields. There was no oil to run them. In Cienfuegos, Cuba, there was one of the world's largest hydroponic farms. The farm could no longer obtain the chemical-based nutrients. Some are made from oil, some use oil in production, and all use oil to be shipped. 13 acres of production represented most of the fresh vegetables for the Cienfuegos area, and it was no longer being farmed. The people of Cuba plunged into a countrywide hunger. The former average diet of 2,100 calories dropped to 1,800. Castro put the country's government and universities on alert to solve the problem. The hydroponic troughs near Cienfuegos were converted to organic production. The sand and rock in the growing trough was replaced with compost. The chemical fertilizers were replaced by worm castings from a worm farm, and organoponics was born. Of all the simplified hydroponics worldwide, Cuba's organoponics is by far the most successful. It is now credited with ending hunger in Cuba, supplying 4 out of every 10 vegetables produced and eaten in Cuba. Today, many families produce vegetables in their own homes, perhaps as many as 1 in every 8, and that's about 1 million gardens. There are 80,000 people who raise food for sale as a home-based or community-based business. Some of these businesses are very successful, and as a whole, organoponics is the biggest new industry in Cuba, most of it owned and managed by people who were in poverty. Cuba has established the technology of organoponics, and this includes the technologies of composting, worm farming, and controlling pests by natural methods.
Yo soy cubano de Cienfuegos. Yo soy cubano de Cienfuegos. Yo soy.
Cuba's first revolution was to use worm castings instead of commercial fertilizers. Long before humans walked on Earth, worms have been diligently converting old dead plant material into purified, nutrient-rich topsoil. The tiny earthworm lives in the soil. Some make their burrows as deep as 6 foot underground. As they chew through the soil, digesting the organic materials, they excrete the digested materials. When Charles Darwin, studying earthworms in the mid-18th century, he discovered that every fertile acre of England's soil, earthworms brought up 7 tons of topsoil, rich in nutrients, for plants. The earthworm brings this topsoil up to the ground out of their burrows. These worm castings are deposited on the ground. 7 tons of fertilizer on every acre of England's fertile soil, 280 pounds of nitrogen per acre, as much as any crop needs, as much or more as modern agriculture applies to the soil to fertilize a crop. In Cuba, a special worm was needed to digest household garbage, animal manures, and decaying plant material. When organoponics started, just 2 pounds of red wrigglers, or California red wriggler worms, were imported from the U.S. Red wrigglers naturally live on the forest floor, digesting the materials dropped from trees. They do not burrow into the ground, but stay on the surface. The Cubans made home for the red wrigglers. These cement troughs, at least 18 inches tall, are usually 2 to 3 foot wide. The worm farms of Cuba are a great example of what can be accomplished in obtaining a good hydroponic nutrient from recycled organic materials.
Aquí del fin fue canción con su guitarra viajera y nació la Cienfuegos.
For a microgarden, there are really two basic forms of fertilizer. One is the inorganic fertilizers, and the second is worm castings. If you wish to use worm castings as your fertilizer, the first step is to build a worm farm. Because red wrigglers are used, the worm farm does not have to be any deeper than 18 inches. The container for worms should be about 1 square yard as the minimum size. Most worm farms for larger farms are 3 foot wide and 18 inches deep, and then as long a trough as practical. The material used for the worm farm is important. A material such as concrete is good because it can retain coolness and moisture. Many of the worm farms in Cuba are made of poured cement or cement block. The worm farms usually need to be in a shaded area. If there is no shade, then the trough can be shaded with a reed cover or even live plants. Once the worm farm is constructed, a bed needs to be made for the worms. The bedding is made of soil, leaves or dried hay or grass, and of food for the worms, such as household organic garbage or manures of animals. The recipe is 1/3 soil, 1/3 leaves or grass, and 1/3 organic waste materials. After the bed is mixed and placed in the worm farm, it is moistened with water. The worms like an environment of 50% moisture, so the bed is moist or damp, but not soaking wet. The worms are then added to the bed. Red wrigglers are sold by worm producers and usually sold by the pound. A pound of worms of mixed sizes and ages is usually about 1,000 worms. 2 pounds of worms should be sufficient to begin a worm farm of 1 square yard. Once established on the worm farm, the trough should be covered with a material like burlap to keep the bed moist. Each day, organic material such as household garbage should be added to the bed. Worms can eat half their own weight every day, so 2 pounds of worms can eat a pound of food. Each day, the bed should also be watered to keep it moist. Depending upon the weather, the bed can use a half to 1 gallon of water per square yard every day. Do not let the bed get too wet or too dry. After about a month, the material in the bed will be eaten and digested by the worms. The digested material that has been eaten by the worm is a black crumbly material called worm castings. Worm castings are an excellent organic fertilizer. Usually it is about 2% nitrogen. That is low in nitrogen compared to the inorganic fertilizers that can be as high as 8% nitrogen. Still, the nitrogen in worm castings is enough to be a useful fertilizer. Because the organic materials have been through a worm digestion, the material should be free of most plant pests. It is relatively safe material to use in your garden. The worm castings can be used in 2 ways. One is to dig a small trench in your hydroponic bed and sprinkle the castings.
Tengo mi lugar, mi son y mi poesía, mi montaña y mi bahía, mi sol, mi río y mi mar, el prado y el bulevar, y el barrio donde nací, y la canción que escribí, que libre remonta el viento, para decir lo que siento por haber nacido aquí en Cienfuegos. Yo soy cubano de Cienfuegos. Yo soy cubano de Cienfuegos. Yo soy. Aquí del fin fue canción con su guitarra viajera y nació la cienfueguera luna de José Ramón. Aquí nació el Aragón con su sonido sin par y nació para cantar al mundo Benny Moré. Y nació Luis Gómez que supo tanto improvisar ese viejo.
The second is to make a hydroponic nutrient water by adding worm castings to the water. A cup of worm castings is measured into a sock or something else to act as a filter and placed in a container of water. Generally, a cup of worm castings is used for 5 gallons of water. The worm castings should stay and soak in the water and then be used as a hydroponic nutrient, sprinkled over the plants. The worm castings tea should be used within a day because if it is left over a few days, it can start to smell. The worm castings that are left in the sock, the spent material, can be returned to the worm farm. In Cuba, most of the worm castings are sprinkled into the hydroponic troughs. The troughs for organoponics were first converted from hydroponic growers 12 inches tall. Slowly, as organoponics evolved, the troughs for the growers became shallow until recent growers are only a few inches tall or bordered by a single layer of brick or rock. The substrate used inside the hydroponic trough is compost. Compost is the name we give to organic materials that have been decayed into a digested vegetable material. This material is a great substrate for roots, but has very little nutrition for the plants. It is usually low in nitrogen, and plants cannot grow in it on their own. The compost in Cuba is mostly made from agricultural waste from the sugarcane production. As with most field crops, sugarcane has parts of the plant not used for sugar production. Those parts are composted to be used in organoponic culture. Composting is a method that converts green plant parts, such as grasses, leaves, or overripe vegetables, into a form called compost. In commercial composting, the vegetable materials are stacked into rows of material as high as 6 foot tall. The compost process is completed by microbes in the pile. To make sure the live microbes are in the pile, a compost starter is often added. The starter is a mixture of live bacteria that are the active agent of composting. Composting can be accomplished without the starter. It can be helpful to add some completed compost to your compost pile to get things started. At home, your compost pile does not have to be 6 foot tall, but it should be at least 2 feet and probably better at 3 foot tall. The reason the depth is needed is to provide an interior that can heat up to a temperature as high as 150-160 degrees. These high temperatures will cook the compost, both decaying the material and killing most plant diseases left in the material. In commercial composting, the large piles are turned about once a week. This is to mix the material, putting new materials into the interior where it can get hot and cook. Turning and mixing the pile also allows the material to get fresh air. Carbon dioxide trapped in the pile are removed, and the material in the pile gets fresh oxygen. This oxygen is needed for the microbes to work. In our small home systems, the pile should also be mixed, at least once a week. As it is turned, watch to see if the interior is still hot. The composting process can take a few months to about a year. In home gardens, it makes sense to have 2 compost piles. One is the pile used to add new materials, and the second is for materials composted a few months before, going through the final cure. Manures of animals can also be composted. However, manure are better composted with a mixture of straw or hay or other vegetable materials. The ideal mix is about 1/3 manure and 2/3 plant materials. Once the compost is cooked and aged, it is used as a substrate in the organoponic trough. After being filled with compost, the worm castings are added and seeds are planted or transplants are put in the trough. In Cuba's organoponics, there is not enough composted materials for expansion for new farms. This limited supply is limiting the further growth of organoponic culture. Organiponic lettuce in trough growers does not grow as fast as inorganic lettuce growers like the floating beds. In an inorganic floating bed, you can expect to grow a head of lettuce a day for every square yard of growing surface. In organoponics, it will take 3 square yards to produce a head of lettuce every day. So you need 3 times as much growing space to produce as much lettuce in organoponics. The revolution in Cuba of organoponic culture has become an important example of how to respond to the oil crisis or declining oil and energy resources. To make organoponics happen required that trucks and cars be replaced with horses. To have the manures used in both worm farms and composting, tractors were replaced with oxen, supplying even more valuable manure. This ready supply of manure replaces some of the oil-based fertilizers that used to be used in Cuba. Cuba still uses inorganic fertilizers on their sugarcane fields, and those wastes are used for the organoponics compost. So organoponics is still dependent on soil-based inorganic fertilizers. But the organoponics does now supply 4 out of 10 of Cuba's vegetables. In our own home hydroponic gardens, organoponics is a good option for substrates and plant materials. It is also a possible method to add to the inorganic hydroponic garden. Excess plant materials and animal manures can be composted and used in the worm farm to produce nutrient and substrate for organoponics. This allows for excess materials to be recycled and used again. For the garden owner, setting up the organoponics means nutrient used in plant materials not eaten is recycled. Cuba's success with organoponics is partly a national effort to support and expand the technology. Cuba produced a television show that taught the people of Cuba how to do organoponic gardening. The government allowed organoponic producers to keep the money they made on their produce. This was unusual in a communist country. Organoponic gardens were started at nearly all public institutions to provide food. Hospitals have their own former lawns turned into organoponic gardens. Schools, from nursery all the way up to university, provide food for their students and staff. Government offices have their former parking lots converted to organoponic production. Universities and agricultural stations have people working on natural methods of pest control. This includes finding fungus or insects that can be helpful to control harmful insects. Cuba is now helping other countries end hunger and reduce poverty with organoponics. There are 45 technicians of Cuban organoponics now in Caracas, Venezuela, helping people in poverty start their own gardens. In a few short years, about 80,000 gardens have been established. This has been supported by the government of Venezuela, so it has had funding. If the process is allowed to continue and the government continues to support it, the effort may end hunger in Venezuela as well. Organoponics is making a difference for many families. It is an important option for people who cannot afford to obtain inorganic nutrients. One of the secrets of success of the organoponic growers is that the troughs are watered twice a day or more. This frequent watering allows the plants to see enough water to grow rapidly. Water can be applied with a water hose. Claudine Mercado waters her 1,000 square meters every day with a water hose. She needs a good source of water to supply the 500 gallons she uses every day. Other gardens in Cuba use a drip irrigation system supplying a pipe of water through the bed with small sprinklers placed 12 inches apart. These sprinklers are turned on several times a day.
¿Y por qué construir organopónicos y no hidropónicos? Porque bueno, realmente, a nuestro criterio, el hidropónico es una técnica más avanzada que el organopónico, desde el punto de vista de poder desarrollarlo. Necesita primero una inversión. Es algo que lleva inversión y por eso hemos ido a la construcción de los organopónicos. Necesita insumos que se nos dificultan también la obtención de esos insumos. Y además que esos insumos también son químicos. La mayoría de los insumos que se utilizan en los hidropónicos son insumos químicos y nosotros de la forma de la construcción de los organopónicos y de la parte de los huertos intensivos, todo lo que usamos es medio biológico. O sea que es parte ecológica lo que utilizamos nada más. Por eso considero que, aunque no dejo de reconocer de que el hidropónico es una técnica mucho más avanzada, pero mucho más costosa. Hoy ya prácticamente nosotros tenemos la extensión de los organopónicos en cada uno de los lugares, los barrios, con el objetivo de que esas producciones lleguen a la población fresca, que la población pueda llegar al organopónico y comprarla directamente y llevársela para su casa a consumir fresca. Antes no era así. Nosotros la producíamos en áreas extensivas, territorios extensivos, y realmente la transportación se hacía distante y cuando iban a consumirla ya realmente no considerábamos una producción fresca.
Yo soy cubano de Cienfuegos. Yo soy, aquí tengo mi lugar, mi son y mi poesía. mi montaña y mi bahía, mi sol, mi río y mi mar, el prado y el bulevar, y el barrio donde nací, y la canción que escribí, que libre remonta el viento, para decir lo que siento por haber nacido aquí en Cienfuegos. Yo soy